Bishop of Portsmouth and approach community as really somewhere close to the core of what our a diocese is, a sort of community of communities. We've got 45 church schools. Commitment to the common good is right at the heart of what Anglican life is about. So it's not about dragging people in case that has to be said. I mean, it's our commitment to, it's informed by sort of deeply Christian values, but it's serving the common good. That's the vision for church schools nationally. It's sort of deeply Christian, serving the common good. And in this case, I know that we would, I'm very interested in it, delighted to meet Kenneth, and great to meet you, Andy, and Susie too. What I think I'm here for is to say that, there is an open door in the Diocese of Portsmouth, which is Southeast Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. About 45 schools we have a particular care for, but then, twice that we're in good relationship with through community schools. But, the door is open to trial, to pilot, to proof concept. And so, yeah, fascinated to hear more and to be a partner alongside you in this. I think if Jeff was here, our director of education, it's 160 schools across Winchester Diocese and Portsmouth, and they outperform the community schools. Sorry, but they do. I'm very proud of them, actually. And we think it's because of their distinctive ethos and culture that keeps getting reported back to us. But so Jeff Williams is Director of Education with something like, I think it's 40,000 children in the schools, 160 schools across the piece. We have a joint Board of Education, a new CIO to run our educational work, so a little bit more arm's length from the church, but with deep church involvement. But the Charity Commission and the government of bringing that into to church schools, that they must be constituted in that way. So I think we could be a good partner. So that's enough from me for the moment, but very committed environmentally. Most of our Portsmouth schools have an environmental group or a council. They've got their hands in mud and out there in as much as possible. But Sarah, is that a start from? Yeah.
Thank you.
Please come and help us to partner well for the sake of the planet and for the sake of these children being out in the open and their mental health being prioritized. That's the end I'm after.
We've asked Kenneth to give a presentation on a social bridging finance, because it really, for me, it really gives us an opportunity to deliver the nature premium in a financially risk-free way. But the most powerful aspect that I've learned through the whole process is that the social bridging finance relies on strong relationships and trust between all parties, and I see that as being a way of meaningful and long-term development of the nature premium. And I think that the other powerful aspect of it is that those taking part have a voice. So we're sharing expertise, knowledge, and motivation to move things forward. So if I could introduce Kenneth. I think you started with a background, but perhaps as Andy and Susie have joined us, perhaps you could just repeat your background a little bit.
Yes, delighted to, and thank you so much for coming at the tail end of a day. I realise everyone's had a busy day, and thank you so much for finding time at 5 o'clock in your diaries to hear about social bridging finance. My background is that I have been a funder worked in funding for the last 15 years, been a chief executive of the largest funder in Scotland, and found enormous reward in doing something like that, but also enormous frustration as well. Because Susie, I'm sure you'll be well aware, as a funder, there are so many opportunities to do good, and at times the system seems to work against you, and it's so difficult to actually get change. And what I wanted to talk about tonight was a model that we had developed, which actually, dare I say it, brings an adult approach to the whole mechanism of how we try and do it. And I've said to Sarah, it's really applied common sense. So you're not in for a lecture on high finance and red braces and the city says this and the city says that. It's not like that. It's very much about someone who's toiled at the coalface, has encountered the problems, and this is a model that we came up with as a team, and which we developed and which we've used, and we've used on multi-million-pound projects, and it has worked incredibly well. I would say also at the outset that there's just recently been an independent evaluation produced by Glasgow Caledonian University on this, and the good news is that it will reinforce everything that I say tonight. So I'm not going to be telling it anything that the independent evaluation doesn't. So without further ado, I've got 7 slides that I wanted to talk through with you, and perhaps I can maybe start if that was amenable to you. Good. If I can do my screen share, and I think this should work, and hopefully you are now seeing slideshow from beginning. Good. Is that visible to everyone? Good, excellent. So as I was saying, this is something I've worked on over a period of time, something which has in a sense been evolutionary, and something which has really arisen because of the kind of problems that we face. And when you look at the public sector and you look at our society, what do you see? You see that everything, in a sense, is being spent on reactive spending. There is no preventative spend. We talk about it, we'd love to have it, but it isn't there. And this was one of my great bugbears as a funder, was that so much of what we spent our money on was actually treating the symptoms. It was the sticking plaster approach, and how little of what we were doing was actually going back and trying to stop bad things from happening. Another feature that we're seeing at the moment, particularly in the public sector, is no new money. Budgets are tight, there is no money that's available, and it leads to the third thing, which is there is no risk appetite. And particularly, I've seen that civil servants are very risk averse, local authorities as well, seen that officials within there, they have no risk appetite. They are not prepared to do things which it would incur any risk or any danger to the public purse. What we see is silo working. We see rigid systems in the public system. We see, unfortunately, things are unable to change. They seem to move in perverse ways, and we know what would be good, but we're unable to change it. In contrast to all that, what we also see is great work going on in charities. We see that there is fantastic pieces of evidenced work, but it's all small, it's all disparate, and none of it is ever scaled or sustained to a place where it can actually make a change to the system. So it's against this kind of background that as a funder, we started to think, well, how could we try and develop this? And to be honest, it's been a long journey, and it was a long road a winding, as the song says, and it started off basically when we looked at social impact bonds, because they were sold as the new thing, the thing which would actually allow us to move to a more preventative spend. And when I looked at it, some of it I liked and some of it was awful. And if you'll excuse the expression, it was a curate's egg, because some of it was really, really bad. For example, the contract, which was at the heart of the social impact bond, was 500 pages. And I went down to Peterborough to the One Service, the prison there, to see it in operation. And it had taken, I believe, £500,000 of legal expenses to get this contract agreed. And I thought, this is terrible. But at the same time, there were really, really good things about it. It worked in a long-term approach. It was a 5-year project. It was bringing people together in a collaborative way. And it was trying to say, well, how do we get change? I went back to Scotland, as you can probably tell from my accent. I'm actually Scottish. I'm based in Scotland. And in Scotland, we've had a thing called public social partnerships. Now, this was something the Scottish government brought in. As you'll be aware, the Scottish government is a left of centre progressive government. And as such, it didn't like social impact bonds because it saw there that someone would be basically they would benefit, or they saw it as benefit. They would be repaid if the project was successful, and they didn't like that aspect of it. And from a social policy point of view, they didn't want to pursue social impact bonds for that very reason. So they came up with something different, which was public social partnerships, which was an Italian model. And basically it said that the public sector and a charity would come together, they would design a new service, they'd work together on it, there'd be a trial, and if it was successful, they would then implement it. The problem with it was there was no agreement. So there was just this goodwill gesture of them coming together. There was no new money involved in it. So somehow the money had to be found to make it happen. And at the end of it, if the trial was successful, the government or the public body put it out to procurement. And lo and behold, the charity that had spent all this intellectual property developing the model found that it was undercut by someone and lost the service. So as you can imagine, it wasn't terribly attractive to a lot of the charities in the Scottish public system. Having said that, there was about 40 of these were done. And interestingly, they all faced the same problem. Where was the money? How could we get new money? And secondly, at the end, how did we sustain this? How do we keep it going forward? And these weren't addressed. Next point on the road journey was the Christie Commission. And as I mentioned, this focus on prevention, it really was saying to government, you've got to change the lens that you look at service provision. You've got to move away from that reactive to the preventative. And going forward, long term, government will be burst if it doesn't do this. If we don't move to a preventative model, then basically the public system will not be able to cope with the demand. What we also saw was that whole thing about sustaining. And as a funder, this was one of the big problems we always faced was if we funded a piece of work, after 3 years, who sustains it? And so many times we heard from the public bodies, we'd love to sustain this, this would be our intention to sustain it. And then they say, you know what, it's been a particularly tough funding round, this one. We just can't, we don't have the money. And as a funder, we're always left on the hook. And what we saw often with the services that were procured, when they were brought in, when the public system actually went out and commissioned services, it was very much a master-servant relationship. Many years before, I'd worked in supplying supermarkets, and it was very similar to the kind of relationship that supermarkets had with the supplier. It was a race to the bottom. It was price cutting. You've got to do it cheaper. You've got to do it better. You cannot make any surplus in this. You've just got to basically do things better for less price. And every time that this negotiation went on, it got tighter and tighter for the third sector. And this is not a good way to run our third sector. It was a master-servant relationship, and I really felt that wasn't playing to anyone's strengths to have that as a major feature within the sector. And obviously, the last thing that I've got there is budget cuts. That is just so prevalent. We're just seeing it more and more that things are being cut back. And we've got a situation now where the public sector knows where it wants to be, but can't get there. And it's that, how do you try and get across to it? So what we developed was a model, and the model's got 5 aspects to it. And the first is design. And what we mean by design is that we take a model which is in the third sector, has been provided by the third sector. It's not a new service. And I think that that's an important difference, for example, from the public social partnerships. We're not suggesting that the model should be to try out new things. This is to take things which already work, which we know will work, but we want to do them either in a different place or to a different scale. And it's to play to the strengths of the third sector organisation that says, we know what we are doing, we know this works, give us a chance to do it. Second aspect of it is there is a contract, and I'm delighted to say it doesn't cost £500,000 and it's not 500 pages, it's 10 pages. We worked very hard at making this whole model legal light. It is a contract and it is legally binding. It's not the kind of contract that you would take to the Supreme Court. It's the kind of contract that will hold people's feet to the fire and realise that actually they've signed a contract, but is a framework on which they work. The third aspect is that there will be a demonstration phase. And that demonstration phase says, we will take this model, we'll trial it, and if at the end of the trial, the success criteria which we set at the beginning are met, then there will be an evaluation. And if the evaluation says the demonstration period has worked, then we will move forward into, and you'll see the final part there is the sustainability. And this is a key part of this model, which other models haven't really addressed, is about sustainability. Now, what we do is we talk about this all at the beginning. All these conversations are had before the project starts. So there's the 5 aspects of it which are discussed and agreed before we start out. And I think this is a kind of adult way to do it, rather than often what happens is when a piece of third sector work is funded, the public body says, thank you very much, let's go on with it, and we'll deal with these issues further down the line when we get there. And sure enough, 3 years on, and everyone's trying to find out how we're going to sustain it as it heads towards the cliff edge. So diagrammatically, put together a little model of what this actually looks like. And it looks like that, which is a bit of a plumbing diagram. But actually, if I can just talk you through it, I think there's some quite important aspects to this. You'll see at the top line that the grant funder, the charity, and the public body, and there's a contract, it's a tripartite contract between those 3 bodies. Now, I have very deliberately drawn the 3 of them the same size and at the same level, because this is a model which is actually about partnership. This is about parity of esteem. This is about working to each other's strengths. Now, the public body, the strength that it has is that it can sustain and it can scale. The charity, its key strengths are that it can bring innovative ideas and it can make things work. The grant funder, the strength that it can bring is that it can bring risk money, and it brings money to this model, which if it doesn't work, well, no one loses their job, but at the same time, they're prepared to take a risk. And if it does work, then it can be sustained, hopefully, by the public body. So what this model says is there will be a trial, and you'll see that there, the bridging finance puts in the 3-period trial. It can be maybe 2 years. It depends on the model. It depends on the service that's been provided, how long it will take to actually prove that it works. And the contract says there'll be the trial period. And if at the end of the trial period, the success criteria that are set at the beginning is met or are met, then there's a commitment by the public body in the contract to say that it will sustain it for X periods thereafter. And you'll see on this particular one, it's 4 periods thereafter. The normal ones that we've been doing are about 2 years for a trial and 5 years for sustained. So in other words, 7 years. And as you can imagine, there's not many models out there that are actually saying, let's look at 7 years of funding. Now, this is a really attractive model to the charity because it knows that if it could continue to deliver the outcomes that it knows it can, it's effectively got 7 years of funding. The public body likes it because it says, wait a minute, if these success criteria are met, it's where I want to be. It's where I know I want to be, at that other end of the bridge. And the nice thing is, if the success criteria are not met, then I just basically get up and walk away. There is no impact on the public purse if the trial doesn't work. And for the grant funder, the really attractive bit about this is it says, I can put my risk capital into this, knowing that if it works, someone else is going to take it on and sustain it. And if it doesn't work, well, we'll take the learning from it and we'll all move on. So what has happened is that it's a really attractive model that when it comes together. You'll see in the middle of the diagram there, project board. And that is an innovation that we put in place, which actually really changes the dynamic. And in that project board, there's the senior representative from the grant funder, from the charity, and from the public body. And they meet probably on a quarterly or a couple of times a year, and basically to discuss the project. And what that does is it gives a completely different dynamic to the project, because the project manager would report back on how the project is progressing. And it's a way of stopping things escalating up the different silos. And it means that people work together in a different way. And for example, on one of the projects that we ran, the project board ran for 2 years. And at the end of it, the trial was successful. And of course, the project board should be dismantled and disbanded. And the people on the public body and the charity said, actually, can we keep this going? Because it's such a good forum for us to meet together to talk about these really important issues to us. So it's been a really different way of working. And certainly the evidence that has been found from the evaluation is that changes the dynamic. It changes it from the master servant to one of real partnership where each is playing to their individual strengths. One of the big issues, obviously, with anything to do with the public sector is around procurement. And what we do with this is that there are different mechanisms of addressing the procurement issue. Because this is innovative, it can get an exemption around R&D. Secondly, it can get an exemption around de minimis, which I think is about 500,000. And the third is actually, and we've had one of the projects took it right through a proper procurement process, and found it very easy, because as you write the tender for this, as you could imagine, the invitation to tender for this is very different from anything that would be a normal commission service. And so what they found was that it was a very straightforward process to go through, and lo and behold, the charity was the one who came forward and was obviously the beneficiary of that, and that was very straightforward to implement. So let me tell you about some of the projects that we've actually worked with on this. The first one is a schools project, and it was based around the attainment challenge that young people in the care system face. And you'll probably be aware that young people the average young person in a school faces a 33%, they've got a 33% chance of going on to university. If you come from a deprived area, you've got a 22% chance. And if at any point in your life you've been touched by the care system, you've got a 2% chance. So really, really stacked against you if you've been in the care system. And what MCR Pathways was, it was a chap by the name of Ian McRitchie. He was a very successful businessman in the City of London, a turnaround expert. And the last job that he did, he turned around a private provider who provided residential schools and residential accommodation for young people in the care system. It was losing huge amounts of money. He turned it around and it was very profitable. But what he found was that the outcomes for young people in the care system were awful, both educationally, emotionally. It just was horrible, the outcomes that they were facing in their lives as they went through this. And so he came back to his native Glasgow, and he spoke to Glasgow City Council and said, I've got money, I would like to make a difference with young people in the care system. And they didn't have a clue what to do with them. And by happenstance, by very good fortune, he met the head teacher from one of the schools in the north of Glasgow, and he said, you come and work with me and we'll make a difference. And what they did was, over 5 years, they developed a model which was an adult volunteer mentor that came in and worked with these young people in the care system 1 hour a week, and it was the power of one good person. And what they did was they turned around the educational attainment of these young people at 2% to 22%. They could see no difference between them and the other kids in the school. And Ian came to me and said, I think I've got something here. I think this is really, really powerful. I think we should see how we can try and scale it. And he had, by this stage, he'd built it out to 5 schools, a cluster of 5 schools in the north of Glasgow. And he said, the Director of Education in Glasgow is interested. So we went to Glasgow City Council and we said, well, we will fund the trial of this for 3 years to go from your 5 schools to 12 schools. And if at the end of 3 years, the 12 schools, the young people are up to 22%, so an easy measure, then Glasgow City Council, you will take it from your 12 schools to all 29 schools in Glasgow City. And on top of that, you will sustain it for 5 years. So the period of sustaining it was going to be for 5 years. So off we set. The contract was signed. It wasn't easy to do. Went through the legal department. There was lots of toing and froing. We got it done and we got it signed. Off we set. 18 months in, Maureen McKenna, the Director of Education, came to me and said, I'd like to stop this trial. She said, not because it isn't working, she said, but I'd be remiss if I kept this as a trial. This is working incredibly well. She said, I'm going to roll it from the 12 schools. She said, I'm going to roll it out to 29. And she said, I'm not going to sustain this for 5 years. I'm going to embed this as our business as usual. So what we'd effectively got was we got system change. And it gets better because John Swinney, who was the Cabinet Secretary for Education, saw what was going on in Glasgow. He said, this is wonderful. He said, I want this rolled out to all 330 senior schools in Scotland, and I'll put £18 million in to do that. So Ian, with NCR Pathways, had effectively taken it from 5 schools to 12 to 29, and now is in the process of rolling out to 330 schools. So all of Scotland will be changed. And you'll see there the quote from Maureen McKenna, and she says how well it had worked. And she said we needed support to move from where we were to where we wanted to be. And what the model allowed them to do was it allowed them to de-risk that, to create a new approach, which then became their business as usual. And what she said was that 18-month gave her the chance to go and speak to her elected officials and say to them, look, this is where we need to be, but we can't get there without this funding. And if we can get it, then we know that that's exactly what we need to do for our young people. And the other thing is, if it doesn't work, we walk away, and it will have no impact on the public budgets. So as you can imagine, a really attractive model from their perspective. And the nice thing is that Maureen said we wouldn't have been able to do it without the bridging finance, because it allowed us the time to do these things and to get the model proven. The second one is in Dundee. And Dundee had the unenviable reputation as being the area in Scotland with the highest exclusion rate for young people. And as you'll know, schools exclusion is one of the strongest flags and pre-indicators of involvement in the criminal justice system. And large numbers of young people being excluded in Dundee and ending up in the criminal justice system and ending up in prison. And they were aware, how do we stop that? How do we get to a preventative model of stopping our young people ending up in prison? And what happened in Dundee was that there was 8 secondary schools around Dundee, and at the centre of Dundee they had an exclusion unit. And what happened was, if you misbehaved, you were sent to the exclusion unit, which was filled with basically other pupils from the other who had been excluded from the other 7 schools in Dundee. Horrendous. The outcomes for the young people here were really awful. What we did was we worked with a charity called Includem and Dundee City Council, and we basically had the social bridging finance model where it was Dundee City Council. They said, we will fund, we will enter a contract with Includem and with the Robertson Trust as the funder, and it was also the National Lottery, who was the other funder on this one. And basically, we had the contract, and it basically said there would be a trial for 2 years of a very different kind of model. And what Includem did was they had inclusion units. So if a young person that misbehaved in school, they were sent to the inclusion unit, which was in the school. And it was manned not by teachers, but by youth workers, because young people who have got problems, they don't just happen, they come from families with problems. And what happened was these youth and family workers would go back with the young person to their family, and they would try and deal with the underlying problems of what was causing the behaviours in school. And this inclusion unit wasn't for just 9 till 5. It was actually weekends, holidays. It worked 365 days a year. And as a result, the school's exclusion dropped to the lowest in Scotland. And what was happening then was that the young people were being included back in. And Dundee found this a hugely beneficial model to adopt. What they did was they used the model, because they were no longer excluding the pupils, they were able to close the unit in the centre of Dundee, and the savings from that, they redistributed back into the schools to fund the inclusion units. And the inclusion units now, because obviously the trial was a success, they are now rolled out across all 8 schools in Dundee, where they now operate with this model of inclusion for young people's behaviours in school, and instead of excluding them out of school and starting them then on that long journey, which brings all the kind of problems with in their future life. So as you can see, those 2 models are very powerful. And again, I think Sarah is going to put in the chat, there's a video of 2 of, in fact 3 of the directors of the different local authorities that we worked with. There's another model, there was another project that we did in East Renfrewshire, very different again, and it was around young people with mental health. And as you'll know, we've got a situation in our country where there's an epidemic of mental health issues for young people. And the problem is that a lot of that is chronic rather than acute mental health. And the situation is they're inundated, the GPs are inundated with this. The waiting list for the CAMHS is horrendous. And what this model was, it was working with the charity Children First. And basically they co-located a children and family worker in the GP's surgery. So instead of the GP referring the child onto the CAMHS waiting list, they were referred to down the corridor to the child, to the young person and family's worker, who would see them almost immediately. There was no waiting list. And they would work with them and work with resolving the issues. And it was a far more effective way. And again, this is it was a 2-year trial, and it's been incredibly successful and is now rolled out across the whole of the Health and Social Care Partnership in East Renfrewshire, and been a great success. And it's actually now a national exemplar, and they're looking about how they can try and roll that model out across Scotland. So hopefully I've whetted your appetite with some of the work that we've been doing. I'd obviously be delighted to answer questions on it. But I think that what we've got here is, and I said this to Sarah before, it's applied common sense. It's just a different way of doing things, and it's doing things in a way which actually plays to people's strengths, instead of, dare I say it, I think that our current model is it plays to everybody's weakness. So that's what I wanted to present you. And as I was saying, very happy to answer any questions that you may have on it. And I will just stop sharing on this now. And that will bring us back to normal screen.
Thank you, Kenneth. Always love hearing you talk. It's it just gives you an opportunity of seeing what can happen when people work well together, I think.